Imagine this. It's a foggy morning in 113 CE, and you're standing on Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain. The mist clings to the stones like ghostly fingers, and beyond the wall, total silence. But it's not peaceful silence. It's the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl and the hairs stand up on the back of your neck, because you know that somewhere out there in the wilderness, wild warriors are watching, waiting, planning their next raid on civilized Roman territory. Welcome to the ultimate clash of civilizations, Rome versus the barbarians. I'm about to take you on a journey that will shatter everything you think you know about ancient history. We're going to meet tribes so fierce that Roman mothers used their names to frighten children into obedience. We'll witness battles so brutal they make Game of Thrones look like a Disney movie. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the word barbarian still sends chills down our spines 2,000 years later. Welcome back to Ancient Rome Revisited. Today we're diving deep into one of history's greatest rivalries. Who exactly were these mysterious barbarians? Where did they come from? And what made them so terrifying that the mighty Roman Empire, the superpower of the ancient world, spent centuries building walls, fortifications, and entire legions just to keep them out? We'll explore the most fearsome barbarian tribes, from the berserker Vikings to the horse-riding Huns, and uncover the shocking encounters that changed the course of Western civilization forever. Before we begin, though, if you love ancient Roman history, then hit the like and subscribe buttons now. That way, you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. If you've just subscribed, then I thank you. Okay, grab your shield and sharpen your gladius, because we're about to enter a world where survival meant everything, and civilization hung by a thread. The birth of a slur. What did the word barbarian actually mean? Let me start with something that might surprise you. The word barbarian wasn't originally an insult. It was just ancient Roman trash talk that got way out of hand. Imagine you're in ancient Rome, around 300 BCE. You're walking through the bustling forum, and you overhear two Roman senators discussing foreign policy. One of them says, "These northern tribes keep making this ridiculous bar sound when they speak. It's like they're sheep." That bar sound was how Romans mocked foreign languages they couldn't understand. To Roman ears, anyone who didn't speak Latin or Greek sounded like they were just saying bar over and over again. It's basically the ancient equivalent of when kids today mock foreign languages by saying ching chong or blah blah blah. Not exactly sophisticated, but humans have always been creative with their prejudices. The Romans were absolutely convinced that their way of life represented the pinnacle of human achievement. They had aqueducts bringing fresh water to their cities, massive amphitheaters for entertainment, complex legal systems, and roads so well built that we still use the phrase, "all roads lead to Rome" today. To them, anyone who lived differently wasn't just foreign. They were uncivilized, primitive, and frankly, barely human. But here's where it gets interesting. These so-called barbarians weren't actually the savage, mindless brutes that Roman propaganda made them out to be. Many of these tribes had sophisticated cultures, complex social structures, and military tactics that would eventually prove superior to Rome's. The Celts, for instance, were master metalworkers who created some of the most beautiful and deadly weapons of the ancient world. The Germanic tribes had democratic assemblies that made decisions collectively, something that would influence modern democracy centuries later. So when Romans called someone a barbarian, they weren't making an objective assessment of civilization levels. They were basically saying, "You're not like us, therefore you're inferior." Sound familiar? It's the same mindset that has fueled conflicts throughout human history. The barbarian nations, a rogues' gallery of Rome's worst nightmares. Now, let's meet the cast of characters who kept Roman emperors awake at night. These weren't just random raiders. These were entire civilizations with their own cultures, beliefs, and reasons for wanting to tear down everything Rome represented. The Celts, Europe's original rebels. First up, we have the Celts. And if Rome was the strict, controlling parent of Europe, the Celts were the rebellious teenagers who refused to clean their rooms. They dominated much of Western and Central Europe before Rome showed up, stretching from Ireland to Turkey. These people were absolutely fearless in battle, and I mean that literally. Celtic warriors often fought completely naked, painted in blue woad, screaming war cries that could be heard for miles. They believed that dying gloriously in battle guaranteed them a place in the afterlife, so they actively sought out the most dangerous fights they could find. Imagine trying to conquer people who genuinely don't care if they die, as long as they take a few of you with them. The Celts also had something that terrified Romans more than their military prowess: druids. These weren't the gentle tree huggers you see in fantasy movies. Celtic druids were powerful priests who practiced human sacrifice, could supposedly command the weather, and held so much influence over their people that they could stop wars with a single word. Romans were so threatened by druidic power that they made it one of their primary goals to completely wipe out the druidic class wherever they conquered. The Germanic tribes, the unstoppable force. Moving east, we encounter the Germanic tribes, and these people were Rome's ultimate nemesis. The Germanic peoples weren't a single nation, but rather a collection of tribes spread across modern-day Germany, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe. What united them was their warrior culture and their absolute refusal to bow down to Roman authority. Germanic society was built around the concept of the warband, groups of warriors who swore personal loyalty to a chieftain and followed him into battle. This created incredibly tight-knit military units, where every warrior would rather die than abandon his brothers. It's like having an entire army made up of Navy SEALs who've known each other since childhood. The most famous Germanic leader was Arminius, who pulled off one of the greatest military ambushes in history. In 9 CE, he lured 3 entire Roman legions, that's about 20,000 men, into the Teutoburg forest and completely annihilated them. When Emperor Augustus heard the news, he supposedly banged his head against walls and screamed, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" The psychological impact was so severe that Rome never again seriously attempted to conquer Germany beyond the Rhine River. The Huns, the nightmare from the east. But if the Celts were rebellious teenagers and the Germans were that tough neighborhood gang, the Huns were like something out of a horror movie. These nomadic horsemen appeared on Europe's eastern borders in the 4th century CE, like a natural disaster with weapons. The Huns lived their entire lives on horseback. They were so adapted to mounted life that Roman sources claimed they were deformed from never walking. They could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop, and their tactics were completely alien to traditional Roman warfare. Instead of forming neat battle lines, they would swarm around enemies like angry hornets, striking fast and disappearing before anyone could counterattack. Under their most famous leader, Attila, the Huns created an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Rhine River. Attila himself was so feared that he was known as the Scourge of God. People literally believed he was divine punishment for humanity's sins. When Attila died in 453 CE, the relief across Europe was palpable. Why Romans hated barbarians? It's complicated. Now you might be wondering, why all the hatred? Why couldn't Romans just live and let live? Well, the answer is more complex than simple xenophobia, though that was certainly part of it. Economic reasons. First, let's talk money. Rome was essentially a giant economic machine that required constant expansion to function. The Roman economy was built on conquest. They needed new lands to tax, new people to enslave, and new resources to exploit. Barbarian tribes sitting on valuable land were obstacles to Roman economic growth, but it went both ways. Many barbarian tribes looked at Roman wealth and thought, hey, why should those toga-wearing city folks have all the good stuff? Raiding Roman territory wasn't just about violence. It was about economic redistribution, barbarian style. Cultural clash. The cultural differences between Romans and barbarians were like oil and water. Romans valued order, hierarchy, and written law. They believed in the power of institutions and the importance of civilization. Barbarians, on the other hand, often valued personal freedom, tribal loyalty, and oral tradition. They saw Roman civilization as soft, corrupt, and unnatural. Imagine trying to explain to a Germanic warrior why he should pay taxes to support bureaucrats he's never met, or trying to convince a Celtic chieftain that he should give up his ancestral lands because some Roman official has a piece of paper that says so. These weren't just political disagreements. They were fundamental incompatibilities in how people believed society should work. Religious differences. Religion made everything worse. Romans were generally tolerant of other religions as long as people also honored Roman gods and the divine emperor. But many barbarian tribes had exclusive religious practices that couldn't be compromised. Celtic druids, Germanic shamans, and other barbarian religious leaders often told their people that Roman gods were false, and that adopting Roman customs would anger their ancestral spirits. This created a vicious cycle. Romans saw barbarian religious practices as backwards and sometimes horrific. And to be fair, human sacrifice was genuinely horrific. Barbarians saw Roman religious demands as spiritual colonization. Neither side could find middle ground. Legendary encounters. When civilizations collided, let me paint you some pictures of the most epic confrontations between Rome and the barbarian world. These weren't just battles. They were civilization-defining moments that echoed through history. The Cimbrian War, 113 to 101 BCE. Rome's first reality check. Picture this. It's 113 BCE, and Rome is feeling pretty confident about itself. They've conquered most of the Mediterranean, and their legions seem unstoppable. Then, out of nowhere, massive Germanic tribes called the Cimbrian Teutones come pouring over the Alps like a human avalanche. These weren't just warriors. They were entire populations on the move, bringing their families, cattle, and household goods in massive wagon trains. Roman sources claimed there were over 300,000 people in this migration, and they were all heading straight for Italy. The Romans sent army after army to stop them, and the barbarians crushed each one. At the Battle of Arausio in 105 BCE, the Germanic tribes killed so many Romans that the river reportedly ran red with blood. It was the worst Roman military disaster since Hannibal, and suddenly the barbarian threat became very, very real. It took the military genius of Gaius Marius to finally stop the invasion, but the psychological damage was done. Romans realized that their civilized world could be swept away by barbarian fury, and that fear would haunt the empire for centuries. Boudicca's rebellion, 60 to 61 CE, when Britain said no. Now let me tell you about one of history's most badass queens. Boudicca was the ruler of the Iceni tribe in Britain, and she had every reason to hate Rome with the burning passion of 1,000 suns. When her husband died, Roman officials decided to seize Iceni lands, publicly flogged Boudicca, and sexually assaulted her daughters. It was the kind of casual brutality that Romans thought would intimidate the natives into submission. Instead, it created a monster. Boudicca raised the largest rebellion in British history. Her forces destroyed the Roman settlements at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans, killing an estimated 70,000 Romans and British collaborators. They didn't just kill, they tortured, mutilated, and completely erased these cities from existence. The rebellion was so successful that Emperor Nero seriously considered abandoning Britain entirely. It took the full might of Roman military power to finally defeat Boudicca, and even then, she chose to poison herself rather than be captured. Her last words were reportedly a curse on Roman rule that would outlast the empire itself. The Gothic War, 376 to 382 CE, the beginning of the end. By the late 4th century CE, Rome was dealing with something unprecedented: barbarian refugees. The Huns were pushing Germanic tribes westward, and these tribes were asking Rome for permission to settle inside the empire's borders. The Visigoths, one of the major Gothic tribes, made a deal with Emperor Valens. They would serve as soldiers for Rome in exchange for land and food. It seemed like a win-win situation. The empire got new troops, and the Goths got safety from the Huns. But Roman officials couldn't resist exploiting the situation. They sold the Goths rotten food at inflated prices, enslaved their children, and treated them like conquered enemies rather than allies. The Goths had fled their homeland to escape violence, only to find more violence from the people who were supposed to protect them. The result was predictable: rebellion. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, the Goths annihilated a Roman army and killed Emperor Valens himself. It was the first time in over 600 years that a Roman emperor had died in battle against barbarians. This battle marked a turning point. Romans began to realize that they could no longer simply crush barbarian opposition. They would have to learn to coexist with it, or risk being overwhelmed entirely. The irony of history: how barbarians became Romans. Here's where the story gets really interesting, and frankly, kind of ironic. Remember all that Roman hatred and fear of barbarians? Well, by the later empire, Romans were desperately trying to recruit barbarians into their armies. By the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the Roman military was filled with Germanic warriors, Celtic mercenaries, and other barbarian soldiers. These men often became Roman citizens, married Roman women, and rose to high positions in the imperial government. Some even became emperors themselves. The most successful Roman generals of the late empire, men like Stilicho, Ricimer, and Odoacer, were all of barbarian origin. The irony is delicious. The empire that spent centuries trying to keep barbarians out ended up being run by them. This wasn't just military necessity, it was cultural evolution. Roman civilization didn't disappear when the Western Empire fell in 476 CE. Instead, it merged with barbarian traditions to create something new. The kingdoms that replaced Rome in Western Europe were hybrid societies that combined Roman administrative skills with barbarian military prowess and social structures. The legacy: why this still matters today. You might be thinking, okay, this is all very dramatic, but what does any of this have to do with modern life? Well, more than you might expect. The Roman-barbarian conflict established patterns that we still see today. The fear of the other, people who look different, speak different languages, or have different customs, is as old as civilization itself. The Roman attitude toward barbarians was essentially an early form of cultural imperialism, the belief that one way of life is inherently superior and that everyone else should adopt it or be conquered. We see echoes of this in modern debates about immigration, globalization, and cultural identity. When politicians talk about defending civilization or preserving our way of life, they're using rhetoric that would be familiar to any Roman senator. But the barbarian side of the story is equally relevant. Many of the values we consider fundamental to Western civilization, individual freedom, democratic participation, and resistance to tyranny, have their roots in barbarian societies rather than Roman ones. The Germanic concept of personal loyalty, the Celtic tradition of warrior equality, and the nomadic emphasis on adaptability all contributed to modern European culture. The ultimate lesson might be that the line between civilization and barbarism is never as clear as we like to think. Yesterday's barbarians often become tomorrow's cultural leaders, and yesterday's civilized empires often become tomorrow's cautionary tales. The Romans built an empire that lasted over 1,000 years, but they couldn't build it without the very barbarians they despised. The barbarians destroyed the Western Roman Empire, but they couldn't have done it without adopting Roman military techniques and administrative practices. In the end, both sides needed each other more than they ever wanted to admit. Rome and the barbarians didn't just fight, they transformed each other, creating the complex, hybrid culture that became medieval and modern Europe. So the next time someone calls someone else a barbarian, remember that you're using a word with a 2,000-year history of misunderstanding, fear, and ultimately, cultural fusion. The real barbarians and the real Romans were far more complex, interesting, and human than the stereotypes would suggest. And that, my friends, is why history matters. It reminds us that the stories we tell about ourselves and others are always more complicated than they first appear. The Romans thought they were the heroes of their own story, and the barbarians thought the same thing. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. If you liked this video and have not yet subscribed to this channel, then please do so now. That way you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. And if this video was of particular interest to you, then I know you will love this video, which looks at Rome's worst military defeat against the barbarians. In this battle, the barbarians completely outsmarted the Romans, leading 3 whole legions into the dark and formidable Teutoburg forest, which the barbarians knew like the back of their hands. This is where the barbarians unleashed hell on the Romans. It's a hell of a story, and I know you'll love it. I'll see you there.